This is Peter Helland on the show Israel with Gus Zuehlke. You recognize him. Gus, we had a show on the 2 minutes to midnight, and we really didn't get to complete that. And you went to a lecture on the geopolitics of mercy, and I think that's Pope Francis's mission to pursue peace. And what we're going to try to do tonight is see how where Pope Francis emphasizing pursuing peace, especially on the international scene, where that fits in to a couple of your discoveries, as how I see it. And one of your discoveries is a guy named Douglas wrote a book on the assassination of Kennedy. And this goes back to Pope John Paul II.
John the 23rd.
John the 23rd, not John Paul II, okay, who interceded with Khrushchev and Kennedy.
That's correct.
And prevented a possible nuclear holocaust. And the geopolitics of mercy has to do with preventing another nuclear holocaust.
I think so, yes.
Okay, so can you kind of go into these, I call them discoveries. You discovered Douglas, and then you also discovered the Pope Francis following in the footsteps of Pope John XXIII, trying to intervene between nations to help them work out some kind of reconciliation.
That's exactly right. And indeed, at this time in history, a lot of people in America are not feeling very comfortable with Pope Francis right now. And I want to suggest that we give Francis a chance. We give peace a chance. Because according to the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, we are set right now, the doomsday clock is set at 2 minutes to midnight. Well, at 2 minutes to midnight, we should be working very hard to get that clock. As people who know this doomsday clock, it can go down and it can go up. Right now, it's at a very, very crucial time at 2 minutes to midnight, and we have to do everything we can to get it back down. In the 90s, it was at 14 minutes to midnight.
Well, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, how close was it then?
I think it was 4 minutes to midnight at the Cuban Missile Crisis. They set the clock prior to the Cuban Missile Crisis. They set it, I think, 2 times a year. The scientists get together from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which was the group of people that worked in Chicago on the Manhattan Project. That's who the folks are that established the doomsday clock.
Okay.
And the doomsday clock is just a measure. I mean, I'm just using it as a warning myself. I believe that it's one of the warnings we need to take seriously. It's a sign of the times.
Yeah.
And I also believe that Pope Francis's agenda of the geopolitics of mercy is another sign of the times. And we got to kind of be willing to step back and really look at things objectively and not be so carried away by every wind of media circus, I might call it.
Right.
That gets in the way of the truth.
But there's only been 2 atomic bombs, Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
That's the only time it's been used. That's right.
And so the idea is we don't want that to happen again.
Right.
And now the bombs are massive. I mean,
much bigger. Yeah, and much more firepower, and a number of countries have them.
So what would happen if a nuclear bomb, let's say the biggest one they got, was to hit New York City? What would happen? Just one. How many bombs dropped on Hiroshima? Just one, right?
Right.
Okay, so if one bomb drops on New York City now, the biggest one we have now compared to then, what would be the damage?
I'm not an expert. What I know is that it would be just absolute catastrophe for the world, because the problem would be retaliation. As soon as somebody drops a bomb on a major city anywhere in the world that has these weapons, then the other people will retaliate.
But people are not. When I grew up in the early 60s,
yeah,
I definitely remember playing football or baseball and worried about Russian planes coming over the woods. I mean, everybody was trained to think that. And then you would go under your school desk, or we went down way down in the cellar in the school to prepare for a possible nuclear atomic bomb attack. Mm-hmm. And so, but people aren't even thinking about that today. In fact, back then everybody was conscious. Everybody's going through drills, but we act like we're a million miles from that.
Well,
what's the truth?
According to the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, we're not.
So we're even closer than we were then.
Yeah, according to them.
Well, isn't that a little weird?
And I've read other intellectuals who say the same thing.
So then, if we're closer now than then why were we going through all those drills, and we're doing nothing now to prepare?
I have no idea. I don't think it's something that's on people's minds in the same way it was when there was the conflict with the Soviet Union.
Okay, so you're saying Pope Francis is aware, and he's trying to do something about it.
Right. I would say that every thinking and feeling person who is awake to these possibilities is trying to do something about it.
Okay.
And people have different roles to play in the common weal, the common good. They have choices, and tonight I hope you can help us explicate what we might do and how we might respond to this crisis.
But the crisis needs some context, and Kennedy came close.
Yes.
And Pope John XXIII helped him negotiate with Khrushchev and bring it down.
Right.
I don't think anybody knows about that. Can you explain what was happening behind the scenes?
Well, what happened behind the scenes, it's a very interesting story, is that Pope John XXIII initiated and worked at getting a private dialogue, secret, between Kennedy and Khrushchev going, and it was mediated by a journalist he knew, and now we have all the documents, because they came out finally, of these letters that went back and forth between Kennedy and Khrushchev in regards to the problems they were both facing. And what's really interesting about some of those letters is a particular moment when Khrushchev, I think he initiates the correspondence, and he's sitting at his home in the Black Sea, and he's looking over the ocean, the sea. And of course, Kennedy has a place on Hyannisport. So he's talking about looking over the sea, and he's pondering Noah's Ark. And he says, we ought to be aware that we're all on this ark. Even the clean and the unclean animals were allowed on the ark. And so whether we consider ourselves clean or unclean, we have to keep this ark afloat. And Kennedy wrote back and said, I like your statement about Noah's Ark. He agreed. So here are these two modern, even maybe postmodern people, one representing the Soviet Union and one representing the USA, and they seize upon a biblical narrative to clarify their moral position. that and they, in this correspondence, they were able to open up a space where they could actually operate as enemies but still understand each other. And so it fulfilled the idea of love your enemies. Loving your enemies is not some kind of sentimental move here. It's actually respecting them in who they are as a human being. And this dialogue between Kennedy and Khrushchev, it's clear. It enabled Kennedy to make the decisions he had to make during the Cuban Missile Crisis that averted war.
But how did the Pope play into that again? Can you say that once again? How did he help negotiate?
Yeah, the Pope actually just got the two guys to think about corresponding with each other. And
he actually helped set it up that they would correspond?
He helped set up the correspondence. That's what he was doing.
So they would send a letter?
Yeah, they sent a letter, and they would...
How'd the letter get there?
They'd give it to certain people, and then they would share it, clandestinely.
Means a plane would fly it?
Well, yeah, somebody would carry it back.
Instead, they didn't do it through the phone? They didn't.
No, they did it. It was all secret.
Okay.
And indeed, that was one of the, according to Jim Douglas's book, that was one of the reasons Kennedy got people mad at him because he was carrying on this dialogue with the enemy. They find out later. They were upset about that.
Because they thought he might be betraying some American interest, or
absolutely. That's part of the reason that a group of people, a rogue group of people, chose to kill Kennedy, according to Douglas.
Okay. What could have happened if the Pope hadn't set that up?
Well, I figure if the Pope hadn't set that up, the Cuban Missile Crisis could have gone the other way.
And then what could have happened?
Well, there would have been a full-scale war, and millions and millions of people would have died, and it might have caused the end of life on Earth as we know it.
So at that time, Russia couldn't send a missile from where they were, but they could send one from Cuba?
Well, to get more specific, they had submarines, and they could have launched them from submarines at that time.
So why was it so crucial to have a base in Cuba then? Just for intimidation, or?
It was seen as a response to the political situation of the times, and they both, went back and forth on it.
Yeah, because that was Sputnik. There was a lot of this was symbolic. Even the war in Vietnam was kind of somewhat of a symbolic.
Well, the war in Vietnam is later. I mean, there
right, but I'm saying during this time
Vietnam,
we did things for political reasons. There may not have been an actual objective strategic, but there might have been a political.
Right. Of course, these things get layered on top of each other. Objective, strategic, political, moral, they all kind of fit together, don't they?
So, but Kennedy learned something from that, and then he had a conversion of some sort to peace.
Absolutely. There was a turning after the Cuban Missile Crisis to a greater degree of rational understanding about peace.
And why do you think that conversion took place?
Because Kennedy, good question. I think to go back to that conversion, there's a very interesting letter that Thomas Merton sent W.H. Ferry in 1960, when Kennedy was running. And he said, I don't have much hope that Kennedy will amount to much. Too much of the time-life kind of guy is what Merton said. And of course, that you've discussed it at length on your show.
David Wemhoff wrote the book about dealing with Henry Lewis and John Courtney Murray, and that was a propaganda tool
Right.
And so that guy was basically saying, if Kennedy's conquered by the propaganda tool of time and life, we're not going to get, we can't expect too much from him.
Right. That's what Merton said. And he said, I don't know if he has the depth to handle this problem. But if by some miracle he turns and has the depth to deal with it, this is what Merton was writing this private letter in 1960. If he has the humanity to turn, he will set himself up for assassination. For that is what happens to people like that.
When you resist the propaganda agenda. Yeah.
Right. And Merton was incredibly prescient in that statement. I mean, that's an incredible statement if you think about it. A guy sitting in a monastery writing letters understood almost better than anybody what was happening.
But the miracle was Kennedy coming close to seeing a possible nuclear holocaust.
Right.
And that precipitated his conversion. So the miracle, and then he started seeing what Merton wanted him to see.
That's right. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, he started to really turn, and aggressively, and faster than the people in the military-industrial complex wanted him to turn. And he didn't care, because he saw how dangerous it was for America's policy to be anything but a rational policy directed toward disarmament.
Okay, but at this point we want to bring in your your quasi-expertise in the military-industrial complex interests, okay? Because now that brings in Gerald Nye,
okay,
your grandfather and your dad knew Gerald Nye,
and I met him in the last year of his life.
Right, and he was a senator,
right,
and Joe McCarthy was a senator, and they both came from Appleton. But Nye,
right, they came from around Appleton
area, and
right,
Nye, for some reason, ended up as a senator from North Dakota.
That's correct, because he moved out there, and
they made him the head of a committee.
The Nye Committee. You can look it up. It's in the 1930s, 1935, 36.
To analyze this quandary that people were having of why did we even enter into World War I?
Right. They did it. It was like an investigation into the causes of World War I. And Nye's committee ended up proposing.
But let me go. Let's go fill it in. The reason they appointed Nye is that North Dakota didn't have any interest in the armaments industry.
Right. That's exactly why Nye was the head of that committee, because North Dakota didn't have any armament interests. So because they didn't, Nye was a spokesman for the people that were free of those concerns.
Otherwise, everybody else would have to recuse themselves because they had a They had an interest.
They had an interest, and so Nye pursued this connection. What later became called the military-industrial complex. You got Eisenhower, in his last speech to the nation, warning people about the military-industrial complex. People should pay attention to that. That's a historical moment.
Right. So what you have here, you have Kennedy now realizing how serious this nuclear holocaust could be.
Right.
And then he converts to pursuing a more energetically peace.
Right.
Which puts him at odds with the military-industrial complex, who benefit by war, as they benefited in World War I.
And Nye was actually uncovering some of the same problems connected to World War I. That's correct.
So his mission was to discover what were the real reasons why we entered into World War I, because apparently they had doubts.
Well, they did have doubts, and there's something mysterious about those committee hearings, is they sort of shut them off pretty quickly in 1936.
But let's just go back just a bit.
Yes.
The people that wanted to set up this committee, what were they suspicious about?
What they were suspicious about, as I understand it, is that the big banks in the country and the armaments manufacturers helped promote and whipped up the war hysteria. and they sort of they more than sort of, they promoted strongly the war interest, and that's what Nye was trying to uncover.
But he didn't. In a way, he's like he's uncovering half the story, because this is to show Israel. So we understand. We've talked about the Balfour Declaration, the Federal Reserve Act, 1913, and Benjamin Friedman was the Jewish man that was at Versailles who became Catholic, converted.
Oh, okay, yeah,
but he argued that.
Well, he argued for a whole nother geopolitical thing that was happening.
Yes.
At that time, that had to do with Europe and so on. Nye was only looking at the American side of it.
True. But with Israel and Zionism, see, in other words, Zionism was a huge force, and that Benjamin Friedman said.
Well, okay, that's one witness, and I'd rather.
Okay. Just tell us.
I think that might.
Just tell us what. Okay.
That might kind of confuse matters, Peter.
Okay, but Nye's only showing us one aspect of what's out there. But what did Nye discover?
Well, he was certainly on the path to discovering a kind of collusion
between the bankers and the armaments
industry, and like I said, it sort of got shut down quick, and then Nye went on to start politically. He was the great leader of the America First movement.
So after that committee finished its project,
yeah,
and he was kind of shut down.
It looks like he was shut down. I'd have to research it a little more closely. I'm not a historical researcher.
Okay,
I'm a religion teacher, right?
Okay, so basically okay, but you know this firsthand because your grandfather was friends with him?
Yeah, my grandfather grew up with him in a little village in Wisconsin outside of Appleton named Hortonville.
Yeah.
And so my grandfather and my father knew Gerald Nye real well. Okay? And so my grandfather was imbued with Gerald Nye's politics. There's no doubt about it.
The American First, Gus, can you explain that a little bit? And I think the Trump election, we're using the same terminology a little bit. So I think it's very interesting how we can take the American First in the 30s and kind of apply it even to today.
Right. The whole notion of America First played quite a role in the current political climate. There's no doubt about that. And indeed, lots of people were hoping, and their hopes have been somewhat muted or disappointed so far, in that the foreign policy doesn't seem to be as responsive to the America First objections to the more internationalist foreign policy of the neoconservatives. Okay? So that really is something that is playing a role right now in our politics. So to talk about Senator Nye is simply to have a historical reference point that helps us understand the current situation.
Well, Woodward's book, and I've been reading little sections of it, where Trump is in the military room,
right?
And Trump came in with kind of a, we're pulling out of these countries. There's no need to be doing all this military stuff if there's no really good purpose. And then he's coming up against these generals arguing for the position of the typical military-industrial complex position, which General Nye was to investigate.
Gerald Nye.
Gerald Nye.
Yeah. That's right. And that was so what goes around comes around. History has a way not of repeating itself, but of rhyming. Right.
So you have Nye in the 30s, and then we go to Kennedy.
Right.
And you're saying his assassination had something to do that he was coming up against.
Yeah, I think Jim Douglas makes this point. Jim Douglas spent 12 years researching this book, and it's fully footnoted. It's carefully documented, and I think it's not just another Kennedy conspiracy book for sure. This one is deep. This one goes deep in a way that no. I was so impressed with this book that I called Mr. Douglas up. I called James Douglas up and said, this book is incredible. And then he sort of tested me over the phone to see if I understood it. And then his response to me was, often I talk to a lot of people who get into the details of the history. He says, but you understand the theological side. And I said, well, that's because of my background, Jim, I said. And so the interesting thing about this book is this key dramatic moment in the book where these peace activists come to JFK. They come to Kennedy, and they're from the big Ivy League schools, and they're Quakers, and they're real serious peace activists. And they make their case for peace to him. And he listens. And toward the end of the conversation, first of all, he gives them more time than they were scheduled to have. He really listened. He told them that a lot of this would have to come from the people, and then the people would prevail over the presidency, because that is the way it works.
Yeah.
But then, as they were getting ready to finish the conversation, John F. Kennedy looked at the peace activists and he said, "Do you believe in redemption?" The President of the United States. It was like the tables were turned. It would be normal to think of a Christian peace activist saying to the president, "Do you believe in redemption?" In this situation, Kennedy said that to them.
So he believed in redemption more than they did, in a sense.
In a sense. Of course he did. And part of it was his war experience of being,
PT-109.
PT-109 and getting carried out into the current and swimming with the wounded guy, and the whole thing he went through with that. But yeah, he definitely was challenging them to do what we have to do now corporately, which is believe in redemption. And that's hard to do. That's no easy thing. I think that we have to have that kind of universal faith in a universal Redeemer.
But can't we?
Right?
Yeah. But I want to just hit on that a little bit, because I asked you the other day. This question does relate. Okay, so you have the mayor of Appleton. You're from Appleton. There's the mayor of Wisconsin Dells. I asked you, who really ran the town of Appleton? People like your dad or the mayor of Appleton? Who really ran the town? Of course, your dad ran the town, not the mayor. So when these people are going to Kennedy, I mean, are we deceiving ourselves to think that Kennedy was in charge? In other words, in this country, is the president really in charge? And isn't that what Woodward's book is discovering? Trump had this agenda to change our foreign policy, and he found out he couldn't.
Okay, well, and
then Kennedy tried to, and then he gets assassinated. And Trump is not going to end up like Kennedy, right? He doesn't want to.
Well, right. I mean, this makes the whole thing very, very difficult. The only answer is what Kennedy said to the peace activists. The people have to make their choices, and the people have to rise up for peace. And Kennedy did, toward the end of his administration, really take the disarmament case to the people. And then he was able to get the disarmament treaty through the Senate because the people changed their mind. Okay?
Yes.
Well, but there were other elites in the military-industrial complex that didn't like that, for sure. And they did clash.
Well, put yourself in the military-industrial complex. Okay.
Yeah.
They are crucial in who they decide who gets to become president, in a sense. These type of people decide who they want to be their president. No, isn't that true? Don't they feel that they really have control over who's going to be president? And that president who they put in, who they feel they do put in, is beholden to them. Well, and when they don't, and when they veer from the people that put them in, they could get assassinated.
Well, that seems to be the point of Douglas's book.
Ah.
Okay?
And so say that again. Say what, in your own words, what was the point of his book?
That John F. Kennedy turned to peace, and he was killed for turning to peace.
Why did that threaten? Okay, is this similar to Paul going into the marketplace, and they try to kill Paul because his message is taking money away
from business?
What's the connection there that you see to the gospel? I mean, to that aspect of the gospel of Paul going in,
right?
His life is threatened.
Right. The truth doesn't always operate according to our self-interest. The truth has its own rules, and so the most important thing about the story of JFK is the willingness of people to actually acknowledge the real truth of what happened. Because if we could acknowledge the real truth of what happened, the powers that did in John F. Kennedy would no longer have that much power over our body politic. See? So that's really the reason the Kennedy assassination is an issue. It's an issue because if we don't acknowledge the truth, we just kind of submerge it and we allow the trauma of the event to just kind of cloud our minds, then we can never be healed. It's about healing. It's about redemption.
Is Pope Francis, in his efforts toward peace, is he coming up against those same forces?
Well, to some extent, yes. I mean, they take a different mask, but the Pope has acknowledged the power of mercy. Now, what's interesting is what Aquinas says about mercy. Mercy is the quality of God's nature that shows forth his omnipotence. That, of course, is in the Book of Wisdom, if you want to look it up. So the point about that is if you really want to talk about God as all-powerful, you're always talking about God as merciful. So mercy never loses hope. Mercy gives people even the possibility, there is the possibility of a politics of mercy. That's where Francis is.
But you don't want to miss, that could be a theological talk that misses most people. I'm just,
Okay.
And Kennedy used the word redemption. Khrushchev is referring to Noah's Ark, and they're trying to bridge a gap between the political and the theological.
Right.
But the word mercy doesn't necessarily register to most people that just live in the political world.
Right. Well, yeah, it's just exactly what Bob Dylan says. We live in a political world where mercy walks the plank. I mean, this is exactly the problem. But the Pope has refused to allow mercy to walk the plank.
Okay.
That's the struggle for Francis.
Is mercy another term for forgiveness? Give me some other synonyms for mercy here.
The vision of Francis is of a diplomacy where there's a political value for mercy, and it's a form of action. You take action. Just like Matthew 25, I was hungry, you gave me to eat. Or the story of the rich man and Lazarus, where the rich man refuses to give mercy, and he ends up in hell.
But see, I take the word mercy as forgiveness.
Well, it's
what definition of mercy are you offering? Is it forgiveness?
Well, it manifests itself as forgiveness. It also manifests itself as compassion in action. Okay, so it's not a concept; it's an action of God. God redeeming us. God having compassion on us.
Okay, so how do we show mercy? How is Francis proposing? What is he proposing as an action of mercy?
Okay, this is where the term the geopolitics of mercy comes in. By the geopolitics of mercy, Francis is talking about like. For example, you're looking for the answers to history and you go to books, okay? And you may well go to books. But for Francis, if you're looking for the solution to the question of how to apply mercy, you go to what he calls the peripheries, the outside places. So if you really want to understand geopolitics, you don't go to London, you don't go to Rome, you go to these out-of-the-way places, and you discover what the people are suffering in the out-of-the-way places. And by discovering that and by responding to it, you bring life to the rest of the body. It's like a doctor that looks at the extremities to register how the rest of the body is operating.
Okay, so what would be an example? I mean, are you talking about when you were in the West Bank in Gaza? Are you talking about places like that?
Unfortunately, I have not gotten to Gaza yet, but I have been to the West Bank. I want to go to Gaza.
Is that the type of place the Pope is talking about?
Yes. He's talking about those outlying places where if you hear the people and you hear their cry for mercy and you respond, then your action of forgiveness and operating in those situations will benefit everybody, benefit the common good.
Okay.
So that, I mean, one example is that in the Central African Republic, where they had a civil war that was basically between the Muslims and the Christians, where a group of renegade Christians destroyed the home of the Muslim clergyman. So the cardinal in that city, in the Central African Republic, welcomed the imam, the Muslim elder, to live with him while his home was destroyed. This is Francis's vision for the geopolitics of mercy, and so that and that's very powerful.
This is a stretch. We took that conference together on Thomas Paine, and that quote in Common Sense that when hatred gets this far, reconciliation is impossible.
Right,
and that's kind of how we even came into existence as a nation.
Well, no, that's exactly that. Hey, I mean, as a real American, I've always got Thomas Paine and Pope Francis arguing in my soul. That's exactly right. Because Thomas Paine is always saying, no reconcilement is possible. You must put up the walls, get out the pitchforks.
that was the whole spirit of the American Revolution.
Okay,
that we were constantly saying, we can't stand you, and we're not about to reconcile.
And then you got the words of wise Christian tradition that reconciliation is possible. Or if you go back to Khrushchev and Kennedy, we all are in the same arc, and we better recognize it before it's too late. We have to come against this torrent of misery, swollen by sin, whipping across the world, by remedying it with the ever-spreading spring of mercy. And it is possible. And it's a terrible thing that we allow the ideology of someone as problematic as Thomas Paine to hold us back from this wonderful news, this good news of redemption and mercy that comes to us from the gospel.
Well, don't we?
Good heavens!
Don't we learn from the 20th century? You had World War I, World War II. Right. And they could have thought, well, God is such a merciful and loving God, He wouldn't allow this to happen. But it did happen. World War I did happen.
Right.
And World War II did happen. And so if we just sit back and go, well, I'm going to trust God because God's so merciful, He wouldn't allow this to happen. That's not necessarily the case, is it?
No, in fact, for the Pope, it's not the case at all. What we have to do is act effectively in mercy and recognize that God's merciful presence can actually change times of war into times of mercy. I've seen it happen. I saw it happen under Archbishop Odama in Uganda.
But let's try to apply this to like World War I. If you applied this to World War I, could World War I been prevented?
Well, we should probably step back and wonder if some of the events that people heard about at the beginning of World War I if they were getting the whole story. Because when they didn't get the whole story, they ran off with half the story, and half a story sometimes creates war. Well, it was half-truths cause people to go to war.
Well, the wars in the Middle East since 9/11, we've had a lot.
Yes.
And they've been premised on the belief that the official story is true. Yet the evidence is so overwhelming that it's not true, but that's not doing any good. Despite all this truth flooding people, they still hold to the lie. So how do you get people to hold to the truth? Isn't that the challenge?
Yes, of course that's the challenge. And the only way to get people to more effectively hold to the truth is to spread love of neighbor and love of enemy around through the gospel. The gospel is the only power that can save. That's why John Kennedy looked at the peace activists and said, "Do you believe in redemption?" I mean, this is just basic Christianity 101. And yet the problem I have is that people have turned basic Christianity 101 on its head, and they start talking about prophecy like it's inevitable. That's one big problem, because Jesus' prophecies weren't inevitable. Jesus' prophecies were like Merton's prophecy about Kennedy. They were contingent. If Kennedy turns, there's a chance for the world. But he might get assassinated because he's turning. But that's called a contingent prophecy. Whereas instead of a contingent, we have a lot of Christians running around with prophecies of inevitability. And there's a lot of people that think war is inevitable right now. And that is a lie. War, according to my understanding of church teaching, war is comes from a series of human choices. And human choices can always be changed before it's too late. Like Jesus said, if you don't repent, you will all perish as they did. But he was giving them the chance to repent. See, but there's always the chance. That's, for example, why I've promoted, for example, the Rosary crusade that's across the country on October 7th, because at St. Joe High School at Bly Field, there will be as many people as possible gathering to pray the Rosary. Why? Because we actually have hope that prayer and choices for love can change things. See? We're not just living in an inevitable slide to Armageddon. And indeed, even the doomsday clock, that's the point of the doomsday clock, is to turn the clock hand down, back, from 2 minutes to 4 minutes to 15 minutes to midnight, rather than allowing that 2 minutes to creep up. That's in the hand. We're left in the hands of our own counsel.
But you're also saying, yeah, there's more action that's needed than just saying the Rosary.
Oh,
what other actions are you proposing besides just saying the Rosary?
Well, besides, yes, that's exactly right. Besides just saying the Rosary, I think we need to, start really looking at the international laws that our country has disobeyed, and we need to work at obeying all the international laws that the international community has given us. And we need to start repenting if we haven't obeyed those laws.
Well, didn't they just come out with the UN? Didn't the UN say that a UN court, international court,
right, that
Iran, it was illegal, some of the sanctions we're imposing on Iran, and we need to repent of that.
Right. That would be an example. If we can just...
And we just flout it. We just ignore them.
Well, and we ignore international law right now in history at our own peril. I believe that. I believe that that's the word for us now. We're either going to live by mercy and law, or we're not going to live at all.
Well, Iraq...
It's either... It's either we change or we're going to annihilate ourselves.
Well, where's the moral voice in America? So if the UN International Court,
right,
says we violated that sanctions we put on Iran, just in this one particular, is in violation of the law.
Right.
And we just ignore it. Can't the church rise up and say, no, you're violating God's moral law by doing that? Well, or is the church so weak it can't speak to the government?
Well, that remains to be seen. But all people of conscience and goodwill, whether they're Catholic or Buddhist or whoever they are, should be really concerned about violations of law.
Well, what did the church, when Bush invaded Iraq, you've talked about this before, where was the voice of the church there? Because it was completely immoral. And did the church have a strong enough voice to deter Bush? He said he prayed about it.
But the Pope at the time, John Paul II, made 50 private diplomatic efforts to dissuade the Americans from going into Iraq in 2003, the second Iraq incursion. They literally begged the Americans not to do this.
And where did you stand back then on that issue?
I was with the Americans, of course, because I was deceived. I will admit, I was deceived because I checked with my friends who all disagreed with the Pope. And they said...
Fellow Catholics.
Some were Catholics, some were not.
Yeah.
But they were all informed, and unfortunately, I made the wrong call.
And what's the basis of that deception?
The basis of that deception, there were a lot of... I think it's largely naive trust in the mass media. I believe that... And that's where you come in with your whole notion of free local media, helping people to balance the messages of the mass media. So I was taken in. I can remember telling the great theologian John Donne the whole theory of the weapons of mass destruction over the table with him. I was eating with him, and I was sure of it.
Well, you believed that they had weapons of mass destruction?
Yes, and I believed that it was our job to go in there and get them. So, I was deceived. I was radically deceived.
But now...
I'll admit.
Now the internet is...
I'm sorry.
Okay, but now we live in a different era because the internet is more powerful and the media is less trusted.
Right. We definitely have some openings now to a better way of approaching these matters. We better use them. And we better keep our First Amendment fresh and alive so we can use them. That's the other thing. The freedom to dissent has got to be protected. The kind of speech you need to defend is the speech you can't stand. Well, you've got to be willing to accept the viewpoints of others.
In the Vatican II, one of the first documents that came out was Inter Mirifica.
Correct.
Weren't they addressing the exact same concern?
Yes, they were. They were addressing the possibility of the media being used improperly for propaganda, especially the dangerous propaganda of war. And one of the key points of Peace on Earth by John XXIII, which he penned in April of the year of the missile crisis, right? No, he finished it in '63. I'm sorry, he penned it afterwards, but he said that people had a right to be properly informed about public events, and this is a real problem with the Iraq incursion, is that a lot of us just weren't properly informed.
Well, weren't they even thinking of things like Time Life? Weren't they even thinking about American propaganda when they came out with Inter Mirifica?
Well, if the shoe fits, wear it. That's what I would say. Yeah.
But has the church lived up to the expectations of Inter Mirifica?
Unfortunately, I don't think the church has lived up to many of the ideals that she proclaims, but we can still work on that. We're still alive, and we're still all here.
Okay, to see the intention of Inter Mirifica, can you explain Inter Mirifica better so people understand what was the intent of that document? One of the first documents.
The basic intent of that document was to get Catholics willing to engage with the media and to have their own place at the table in national media and international media.
And they've been continually falling short of reaching that goal, haven't they?
Well, they make efforts, but we still have to work very hard on this.
So this is what we're doing even now.
No, it's an effort to do that.
Okay. This book is very helpful, Douglas's book.
Right, right. I would definitely read, if there's one book you read this year, read JFK and the Unspeakable by James Douglas. You will not be disappointed.
Is there any other books that are helping to focus, how would you say it? Senator Nye called it the armaments. That was behind World War I. Was there any conclusion that he came to?
Well, I could quickly suggest that Pope Francis has a code that is very, very helpful. There are 8 points or 7 points of his Geopolitics of Mercy, 8 points. First of all, mercy is an action of God. God acts in the world by way of mercy. If you look at the presence of God in history, you see that you can see God's merciful presence and you can act on it. Mercy can be a diplomacy. There's a political value of mercy. Mercy involves a new spirituality where the love of neighbor and respect for human dignity is a way to a new way of life. Mercy has to do with not living by theories, but rather living by the real dynamics, how mercy operates in relationships. And if we try to put scientific theories, make them more important than people, we end up with the idea that we think we can get mathematical certainty about love, which is stupid, basically. I mean, we're not numbers. We're people, and we have a free will. Another point is that open thought, free thought, is really important because the Holy Spirit pushes people beyond the boundaries of their thinking. It's not a matter of rewriting history, but moving history forward. That's another important thing. And to remember that if you want to have conflict, just fight for power. Because fighting for power is at the root of all conflicts. See? And language that takes sides in that way just divides people. The history of the world is not a Hollywood movie where, you know, the good guys always win. Or, you know, there are moral ambiguities to history, and the true Christian has to dive into the middle of those moral ambiguities. We're not fundamentalists in the sense that, number 3, we're light years away from the notion of the clash of civilizations. There's not a final clash of religions. We're not involved in a neo-crusade. We don't live out of insecurity. We live out of love, and the chaos around us doesn't make us afraid. We don't get into just party scenarios where my party is better than your party. Kind of like the old kennel ration commercial. My dog's better than your dog because my dog eats kennel ration. That's the politics of the parties, and what we want to do is move beyond that to the common humanity. The law we try to live instead is love for the neighbor, love for the enemy. Take seriously the love for the enemy, and out of that love for enemy, build harmony. The gospel love of enemies is the triumph of mercy. Catholicism is not a guarantor of power. That's another point. We're not using the church as a guarantee of our temporal power. We let go of the temporal baggage and we live according to the power of spirituality. We never make the cross a banner of political struggle. We make the cross the core of our relationships. We wash feet instead of looking for power. We don't have what they call, what Henry Kissinger referred to as a Masada complex, where the whole world is out to get us, and we have to raise the pitchforks. No, we don't see the world that way. We don't see the world as globes and maps and power. Rather, we see the world as the poor rising out of the peripheries with their wisdom to teach us lessons. The key thing about this kind of diplomacy is it's a field hospital. It's not on a hill, kind of like a fortress. We're in the field. We're treating the wounded. We're trying to save lives. We think about the possibility of war, and what we want to do is turn that into the reality of peace. It's not abstract. We have to actually go where the conflicts are and bring healing to those areas. And we do that with a great deal of concern for solidarity with others, for the common humanity I mentioned before. Conflict cannot be eliminated, but we have to act on the most unlivable parts of the conflict and apply Matthew 25 to them so that there's real healing. And solidarity is another name for mercy. Now, I've kind of summarized. I hope that that's somewhat helpful.
Well, isn't there a flip side to mercy too? I mean, what's the balance to? If you go so much mercy, is there a balance to this?
Well, yeah, you got to have justice too, and but justice is always qualified by mercy, and what we mean by that is you can't just make a calculation of human rights, and everybody just fighting over their rights becomes the only story. Somehow in the struggle for rights, you got to have people that add love to the other, to love to the enemy, to that formula, so that the fighting over rights just doesn't generate into a Hatfields and McCoy's kind of situation. Okay?
Yeah.
So that's a first effort to answer your question.
Well, blessed are the peacemakers, for they are the children of God. So there has to be a real big effort, knowing that a child of God has to pursue peace, right?
Right, and we do that by being gratuitous in our gratitude, by being filled with the gratitude for being children of God and letting that gratuitous sense flow out to everyone we meet. And out of that gratitude, we build a new world.
Right. You're saying that Kennedy himself was trying to lay a hold of that kind of principle, and that's what ultimately ended up in his assassination. And you have to have people willing to do what Kennedy did.
Absolutely. If we had more people like that, we'd get this thing off the ground.
But you could get martyred.
It's beyond justice, and that's the key thing. Martyrdom is actually a work that's beyond justice. That's right.
Okay. Well, I think we're coming to the close here. This is the show Israel, and you're going to be going. You planning going back to Israel? Or are you going?
Not right now. I'm going to Uganda.
You're going to Uganda.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is Peter Helland with Gus Zuehlke on the show Israel.